Unitarian Universalism is a religious tradition that attracts people from many different spiritual and religious backgrounds, including none. And so many Unitarian Universalists in this congregation and throughout our denomination are themselves Jewish or have Jewish families or come from Jewish backgrounds. So I wanted to talk about Hanukkah today to honor that part of our spiritual mosaic. And then we'll also use the themes of Hanukkah as a sort of springboard for a conversation about Unitarian Universalism, as is our usual practice. The Hanukkah, or the 8-day Jewish Festival of Lights, began on sundown, November 27th, and ended the evening of Thursday, December 5th. And I'm sure that most everyone is aware of this, or is at least aware of when it started, because there was a convergence this year of Hanukkah and Thanksgiving, right? There's this sort of once-in-a-blue moon aligning of the Jewish and the Gregorian calendar, which gave rise to this unique phenomenon of Thanksgivicka, which was sort of a cross-cultural mashup, celebrated, if Wikipedia is to be believed, by such solemn cultural markers as a dreidel float in the Macy's Thanksgiving Parade, the release of a Thanksgivicka-themed single by something called the Dirty Sock Funtime Band, and the pardoning of a kosher turkey by a Long Island rabbi. Hanukkah probably hasn't been this high profile in the secular pop culture world since Adam Sandler did his Hanukkah song on Saturday Night Live. Perhaps you remembered to tell your friend Veronica that it is time to celebrate Hanukkah. So the irony here is that Hanukkah is in part a holiday celebrating resistance to that kind of cultural mashup, that kind of cultural assimilation. The story of Hanukkah is the story of the struggle of the people of Israel to remain apart, to retain their Jewish identity in the face of a Greek empire that was at the time determined to first absorb them, and failing that, to crush them. Now there's a common perception, I think, in America anyway, that the function of Hanukkah here is also sort of to prevent assimilation. It's to take the shine off of Christmas a little bit for Jewish children who might otherwise be feeling left out this time of year. It's to reduce the allure of our mass market, commercialized, secularized celebration that we do in December, and replace it with their own occasion for December lights and gift giving and celebrating, one that's tied to the history of their own people. Hanukkah is sometimes somewhat dismissively described as a minor holiday that's been sort of elevated in order to help Jewish parents compete with Santa Claus. So I asked a Rebbitzin friend of mine about this, that's the wife of a rabbi, and she agreed that Hanukkah is a quote-unquote minor holiday. But she explained that that's a technical term, which means that it's not one of the holidays that's described and commanded in the Torah itself. But she continued that doesn't mean that Hanukkah is not important. And indeed, the story of Hanukkah and the traditions behind it, they're rich and they're complex and they're surprisingly, spiritually very weighty for a holiday that's popularly associated with things like dreidels and fried food and little gifts of gold and chocolate. So the story of Hanukkah is told in the book of Maccabees, which curiously enough is not one of the canonical books of the Torah. It's in the Catholic Old Testament, it's in the Orthodox Old Testament, it is not in the Jewish scripture. They consider Maccabees to be apocryphal, meaning it's worth reading, but it doesn't belong with the holiest of holy books. Like many Bible stories, even apparently the ones that don't make the cut, the story of Hanukkah is incredibly gruesome and violent. So if this service inspires you to rush home and read 1 Maccabees, don't say that I did not warn you. All right? And be sure to thank John Cody for his wonderfully kid-friendly retelling during Words for All Ages, because believe me, he was not given G-rated material to work. So the background of the story is the spread of Greek culture, or what was called Hellenism, throughout the East by the legendary Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great, wherever he went tromping across the land with his mighty army, he left 2 things in his wake: orphans and Greek cities. And after he died, his empire very quickly fell apart, but the Greek cities remained, dotted all over the Near East, including the Middle East. Chaim Potok, in his book Wanderings, recounts that at this time a Greek city sprang up just 40 miles north of Jerusalem. And suddenly, these two very different cultures were bumping up against each other where they never had before. A Jewish culture at that time and in that place was local, tribal, conservative, monotheistic, highly spiritual, and dominated by tradition. Hellenistic culture was cosmopolitan, individualistic, materialistic, sensual, rootless, rationalist, and pagan. Could not have been more opposite. Now, if you wanted to join the Hellenist culture, if you wanted to be assimilated into Hellenist culture, religion was generally no obstacle. The Greeks were highly syncretist in their practice of religion, meaning that they just sort of went around hoovering up every local god that they encountered, bringing them all in to this expanding pantheon. The more the merrier was the Greek approach to deities. You worship Micmac, the god of cheese? Awesome! We need the god of cheese. Bring it in. There's room for all of them. As long as you were willing to have your god be one god among many, as long as you weren't going to throw a fuss about the occasional graven image or golden calf, Hellenist culture was a remarkably tolerant culture. It was also very rich, and it was very sexy. So the rich part, the Hellenist state was a state that was remarkably open to talent. It was a society in which you could rise in if you had the mind and the ambition. It was a brutally competitive meritocracy that needed politicians and government functionaries and bureaucrats. So there was wealth and power to be had if you were young and ambitious. Secondly, the sexy part. Hellenist culture was a culture that seemed to be in love with the body in a way that was contrary to Jewish culture at that time. It was a world where they sculpted just achingly perfect nude statues, and then they put them everywhere. They put them right in the public square. They put them in their temples. It was a world in which young people trained nude in the gymnasium, and then they competed nude in sports. There was just a lot of nudity going on in Hellenism. And there were a lot of sports. There was running, there was wrestling, there was boxing, there was javelin tossing. The Jews didn't really have sports. So, wealth, power, sex, sports, people like that stuff, right? That stuff was just as appealing then as it is now. So some of the Israelites were looking at that stuff and going, okay, I think I want in. Get me some of that. So we read in Maccabees, in those days, lawless men came forth from Israel and misled many, saying, let us go and make a covenant with the Gentiles round about us. For since we separated from them, many evils have come upon us. This proposal pleased them, and some of the people eagerly went to the king. He authorized them to observe the ordinances of the Gentiles. So they built a gymnasium in Jerusalem, according to Gentile custom, removed the marks of circumcision, and abandoned the Holy Covenant. They joined with the Gentiles and sold themselves to do evil. So in Maccabees we read that some of the Israelites began to assimilate themselves to this larger, very attractive Greek culture. A gymnasium sprang up in Jerusalem, we read, right next to the temple. So you had priests doing their rituals in the synagogue, rushing over to the gymnasium, exercising naked, rushing back to the temple. Totally crazy. The young were adopting Greek ways. They were abandoning the articles of their faith. And those articles consisted of the covenant that they had made with their God. Now, as Unitarian Universalists, we're maybe sympathetic to these young people. We are a highly syncretistic religion ourselves. We value individual freedom and individual choice. We value these things over tradition and tribe quite often. We don't ask our youth to follow in our path. Or perhaps we're sympathetic sympathetic to the traditionalists. Perhaps we also sometimes feel like we live in an age where a sort of seductive, monolithic culture, say the culture of global corporate consumerism, seems to run roughshod over all local values and local traditions. Our communities are turned into just collections of rootless individuals. And it replaces the careful nurturance of enduring values with the short-term gratification of shiny things. Maybe we're sympathetic to both views and we feel the push and pull. The questions raised by cultural collisions are multifaceted and they're complicated. Now in Jerusalem, many pious Jews began to push back at this alien cultural force in their midst. They saw that their way of life was just being overwhelmed by what was, it must be reminded, an occupying force. It was not just an alien culture, it was an occupying culture. It was an imperialist incursion into their land, backed by an army, paid for out of their taxes. So tensions rose between the Greeks, between the observant Jews, and between the Hellenizing Jews, the Jews who were assimilating. And out of that tension there began to be acts of violence, and there began to be instability, and sometimes even riots. So, into this powder keg of a situation steps a newly anointed ruler of this empire, Antiochus IV. He was fresh from a military victory in Egypt. He was apparently feeling his oats, and he thought on the way back from Egypt he would just stop over in Jerusalem. And while there, he took the unprecedented step of clarifying this situation by banning the practices of Judaism entirely, on pain of death. He also humiliated the Jews by going into the temple, stripping it of its wealth, and defiling it by erecting pagan altars and performing pagan sacrifices inside the holiest of holies. So this was a radical departure from the usual Greek practice of tolerance, and we don't really know why it happened. Chaim Potok speculates that this Antiochus, he was looking at the example of Rome, and he wanted this sort of cosmopolitan, unified empire that he could easily rule. And he saw the Jews with their sort of stubborn particularity, their refusal to be absorbed. He saw them as an obstacle. And so he chose the path of death and destruction, and that's what he got. Now, the immediate response of the Jews to these decrees was martyrdom. Many, many Israelites, when pushed to this limit, chose to continue to practice their faith, and they paid a grisly price. And many, many people were killed. Next came armed resistance. The Hasmonean family took to the countryside. They organized a guerrilla force out of peasants, and they began to wage insurrection. And the famous Judah, called Maccabeus, which means the hammer, he led this sort of ragtag army against what were highly trained, overwhelming imperial forces. And astonishingly, he won. And he won again, and he won again. 4 years into the war, they had succeeded in beating back the invading forces of the empire, and they even reclaimed the temple. And then, with Antiochus off sort of dying in some foreign land, he fought a lot of wars, this Antiochus. It was left to the governor of Syria to rescind the persecutions, the rule of non-observance, meaning that Judaism could be practiced again, and the temple could be rededicated to Yahweh. So the Hanukkah miracle comes out of this episode of the war. They had just reclaimed the temple, and they began to re-sanctify it, and in order to do that, they needed to light a menorah. They only had enough oil for 1 day. It takes 8 days to make more oil, but they went ahead and lit it anyway, and miraculously in the story, the oil continued to burn for 8 days, just in time for the new supply to be put to use. So the Jews of the Maccabean Revolution, they had a vision. They had a higher value for which they were willing to risk all and sacrifice all, even unto their lives. And that vision was the survival of their people as a specifically Jewish people. It was the survival of their religion. And they believed that faithfully fulfilling the covenant that they had made with their God, the covenant that they had made with Yahweh, was of greater value than any material reward. It was more important than anything else on earth. And so they refused to be assimilated. The miracle of the oil to them was a sign that they were right to be faithful. That their faith was grounded in a living God who had not abandoned them, and the fact that the oil continued to burn was his visible sign to them that he was on their side, that they had the right to trust in him. The enduring light of the Hanukkah lamp, then, is the visible symbol of the eternal and the transcendent. In Unitarian Universalist terms, we would say, it is that which demands our ultimate loyalty, that to which we properly turn our minds and hearts, and that in which we properly place our trust. As Unitarian Universalists, we have our own vision, expressed in our principles and our sources, enacted in our struggles and the commitments we've made throughout our history. And I won't say that our vision is opposed to modern American culture. Indeed, we have done a lot to shape modern American culture. But at points, our vision is certainly in tension with modern American culture, right? Especially that corporate consumerist vision. There's some friction about where our ultimate loyalties should lie. We imagine a future in which the oppressed are freed, the hungry are fed, the sick are tended to, the mind is educated, and the spirit is nurtured. We imagine a world in which war, hunger, prejudice, ignorance, and tyranny are distant memories, replaced by freedom, justice, reason, and love. We imagine a world in which we have regained harmony with the natural world that supports and sustains us. That is the larger vision to which we covenant to be faithful. And there are certainly friction points between that vision, the world we imagine, and the world that we inhabit. What we want for the world and what it sometimes seems to want from us. And so there are points where we have to decide, are we willing to stand apart, or will we be assimilated? And if we choose to stand apart, if we place our ultimate loyalty with our religious vision, then what then, if any, are the grounds of our commitment to that vision? That's something we ask ourselves. What sustains our trust that we are right to put it on the line for those transcendent values? When the siren song of the world says, forget about that reason stuff, that love and justice stuff, there's money to be made, there's football on TV, you have to go along to get along. What gives us confidence or even optimism to say, no, there's a different way, and I'm going to stick to that way? Well, one strand of our tradition says, there's a force of love. There's a living energy that embraces the world or is immanent in the world. There's a power greater than our comprehension that calls the world back to healing and wholeness. Whether we call it God or Goddess, Great Spirit, Great Mystery, there's a force that calls the world back to wholeness. One strand of our tradition places its confidence in the human spirit, in the power of our reason to discern the good, in the power of our conscience to choose the good, and in the power of love and courage to restore the good. That strand of our tradition says if there can be a Gandhi, if there can be a Martin Luther King Jr., if there can be a Nelson Mandela, then there is always reason to hope. Now, these strands are not mutually exclusive, of course. But whether we place our confidence in the divine spirit or the human spirit or both, all the strands of our tradition teach us that ultimately that vision only becomes a reality in us and through us. That it is up to us to create the world that we dream. That we are the voice of reason and we are the hands of God. Now, this is the last sermon that I will be preaching until Christmas Eve. So I want to end today by wishing everyone a happy holidays. And I want to remind you all, before the hustle and bustle of the holiday season sort of descends upon our heads, take good care of yourself. Right? This can be a tough time of the year. Eat healthy food. Exercise when you can. Look up at the stars on these beautiful winter nights, even in light-saturated Fisher suburbs. There are beautiful starscapes on winter nights. Look at them. Remember to sleep. If you find yourself feeling lonely or isolated, take advantages of activities that are going on here at UUI, like the midweek meditation service next week. There's so much going on here. Take advantages of activities at other churches, at community centers. Volunteer at a soup kitchen, volunteer at a community center. Serving others can be a wonderful way to beat the holiday blues. But mostly, just be kind to yourself and be kind to others. And I invite you to take time, find time, steal time if you have to connect to that source that refreshes your spirit. Divine or human, that source that sustains you in your hope and your commitment to a better world. Because ultimately, it is up to each of us, each beautiful, unique, unrepeatable human soul to carry that vision forward, to nurture it while we have living breath, and to pass it on to the future. We are the vessels. May we all be vessels of enduring light. Amen. Now, our closing hymn today is number 1030 in your teal hymnal. It originated in South Africa, and I chose it part because it fits with our theme, and in part because it was sung in anti-apartheid protests. And you'll notice the first line is written in Zulu, and the words mean we are marching in the light of God. So we actually are going to sing the Zulu for the first verse, and then we'll switch to the English. And the way this works is I'll call out some substitutions, and when we get back around to we are marching, you'll know we're done. So first, though, I want everyone to take a moment and just sort of practice the Zulu with me. So it's Siyaham Bakukanyen Quen Kos. So Siyaham Bakukanyen Quen Kos. I Siyaham Bakukanyen Quen Kos. Try it another time. Siyaham Bakukanyen Quen Kos. Okay, so I think we all recognize that there's a potential for things to go very wrong here. So I just want to remind you that there is no bad singing in church. There is just not singing and joyful singing. So let's do some joyful singing. Please rise in body or spirit as you are able. For number 1030, see you around. Let's have a hand here. I wish you all a blessed holiday season. May you be safe. May you be joyful. May your parking spaces be open, and may your batteries be included. And now we extinguish the flame of our chalice, but not the light of understanding, the warmth of compassion, or the fire of penance. Let us hold these things in our heart until we meet again. Go in peace.